Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. I never used that closet. Not because I was afraid, just because it never seemed to belong to the room. Its door felt too heavy, its hinges too silent. One night, I left it cracked open. The air that crept out wasn't musty or cold. It was warm, moist, like breath. I pressed my hand against the gap. Something touched back. Not skin, not fabric. Something that pulsed. Now I keep it open just a little more each night. And each morning, the carpet feels slightly softer under my feet. Like it's remembering how to yield. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not unpleasant exactly, but wrong for the space. It reminded me of rain on hot asphalt, that metallic sweetness that rises when water meets something it shouldn't. I'd been living in this apartment for 6 months, and the closet had remained untouched. A dark rectangle in the corner of my bedroom that I'd filled with boxes I never opened and clothes I never wore. But that night, something made me approach it. Maybe it was the way the moonlight fell across the floor, creating shadows that seemed to bend toward the closet door. Or maybe it was the sound, so faint I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. A soft, rhythmic whisper, like fabric brushing against fabric, coming from behind the heavy wooden door. I stood there for what felt like hours, my bare feet growing cold against the hardwood, listening. The sound wasn't constant. It would fade until I thought it had stopped entirely, then return just as I was about to walk away. Each time it came back, it seemed slightly closer to the door, as if whatever was making the noise was moving around inside that small, dark space. The door handle felt warm under my palm. Not the kind of warmth that comes from sunlight or heating vents, but something alive, something that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. I turned it slowly, expecting the usual resistance, but it opened with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for me to try. The air that flowed out was thick, almost syrupy, carrying that strange scent more strongly now. It wrapped around my ankles like invisible water, and I felt my skin prickle with goosebumps despite the warmth. I peered into the darkness, but my boxes and clothes were exactly where I'd left them, undisturbed and ordinary, except for the breathing. It was soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakably there. The kind of breathing you hear when someone is trying very hard to be quiet, when they're holding their breath and letting it out in careful, measured intervals. I reached for the light switch, but my hand hesitated. Something told me that illuminating the space would be a mistake, that whatever was happening in there needed the darkness to exist. Instead, I extended my hand into the closet, feeling the warm air move around my fingers like something alive. The clothes hanging there brushed against my skin, but they felt different, softer, more yielding, as if they were made of something other than fabric. When I pressed my palm against the back wall, it gave slightly under the pressure, like pressing against someone's chest. That's when I felt it touch me back. Not a hand, not exactly. Something that pressed against my palm from the other side of the wall, matching the pressure I was applying. It was warm and firm, and it moved in slow, deliberate patterns across my skin. I should have pulled away, should have slammed the door shut and never opened it again. But the touch was strangely comforting, almost familiar, like recognition without memory. I left the closet door open that night, just a crack, and went to bed with the warm air flowing gently across my room. I slept better than I had in months, deeper than I had since moving to this place. But when I woke up, the carpet felt different under my feet. Softer, more responsive, as if it had absorbed some of that strange warmth and was now giving it back to me with each step. Over the following days, I began to document what was happening. I started a journal, writing down every detail I could remember, every sensation, every change in the room's atmosphere. The closet remained slightly open, and each night I would find myself drawn to it, pressing my hand against that giving wall, feeling that presence respond to my touch. The breathing became more pronounced. Sometimes I could hear it during the day, a soft whisper of air that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I recorded it on my phone, but when I played it back, there was only silence. The scent grew stronger too, that metallic sweetness that now seemed to permeate everything in the room, my clothes, my sheets, even the air I breathed. I started leaving the door open wider each night, just a little more each time. The warm air flowed more freely, and the carpet continued to soften, creating a path from my bed to the closet that felt almost liquid under my feet. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night to find myself standing at the closet threshold, my hand already extended into the darkness, already pressed against that yielding wall. The wall began to change. What had once felt like solid would now had a texture that was almost organic, warm and slightly damp, like skin that had been underwater for too long. When I pressed against it, it would press back, and I began to feel ridges and contours that suggested something much more complex than a simple wall. Sometimes I thought I could feel a heartbeat, slow and steady, pulsing against my palm. My reflection in the bedroom mirror started to look different. Not dramatically, not in any way I could easily explain, but there was something in my eyes that hadn't been there before. A kind of knowing, a recognition of something that I couldn't quite name. I looked like someone who had discovered a secret that was too large to contain. The breathing wasn't just coming from the closet anymore. It seemed to fill the entire room, a gentle rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. When I sat quietly, I could feel it in the walls, in the floor, in the very air around me. The apartment was breathing with me, or I was breathing with it, and the distinction was becoming harder to make. I began to spend more time with my hand pressed against the closet wall, feeling the strange warmth flow through my fingers and up my arm. Sometimes the sensation would spread through my entire body, a tingling that started at the point of contact and radiated outward until I felt like I was dissolving into the warmth itself. In those moments, I understood things that I couldn't articulate, felt connections that had no names. The carpet had become so soft that walking on it was like walking on clouds, each step sinking slightly before bouncing back. The path from my bed to the closet was now clearly visible, a darker, more yielding strip that seemed to guide my feet even when I wasn't consciously choosing to walk there. I found myself following it without thinking, drawn by something that felt like gravity, but warmer, more welcoming. One night, I woke to find the closet door completely open, though I couldn't remember opening it that wide. The warm air flowed freely now, and the breathing had become so pronounced that it seemed to fill the entire space. I approached the closet and pressed my hand against the wall. But this time, instead of the usual gentle resistance, my hand sank into the surface as if it were made of warm clay. I should have been frightened, should have pulled away and run. But the sensation was so encompassing, so complete, that I found myself pressing deeper, feeling the wall envelope my hand, my wrist, my forearm. The warmth spread through my entire body, and I understood that that I was becoming part of something larger, something that had been waiting for me to understand what it was offering. The wall pulsed around my arm, and I felt that heartbeat more clearly now, strong and steady, and infinitely patient. I was connected to something that had been there all along, something that had been breathing with me, waiting for me to breathe with it. The apartment wasn't just my home anymore. It was alive, and it recognized me as part of itself. When I finally pulled my arm free, the wall sealed itself seamlessly, but the warmth remained. I could feel it flowing through my veins, changing something fundamental about how I moved through the world. The carpet beneath my feet felt like an extension of my own skin, responsive to my thoughts and emotions. Now I keep the closet door wide open, and the warm air flows freely through my room. The breathing has become so natural that I only notice it when it stops, which happens sometimes, just for a moment, as if whatever is breathing with me needs to pause and remember how to continue. In those moments of silence, I hold my breath too, waiting for the rhythm to resume. The mirror reflects someone I'm still learning to recognize. Someone who has touched something beyond the ordinary world and been touched in return. Someone who has discovered that the walls we think separate us from the unknown are thinner than we imagine, and that sometimes, if we're very patient and very quiet, we can feel them breathing back. Did you like this story? It gave me chills not from fear, but from the eerie intimacy between the protagonist and whatever lives beyond that wall. A presence that doesn't invade, but welcomes. What would you have done? Would you have left the door open? Let me know in the comments. Now let us move on to the next story. Story 2. It started with angles just a few degrees off. My shadow would bend differently at the corners, tilt when I didn't move. Then it began lagging. I'd turn and it would hesitate, still facing forward, like it wanted to keep watching something behind me. Now it watches me. At night, under a single light, I sit perfectly still, and I watch it study me. It twitches sometimes, like it's preparing to act first. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just the echo now, and it's the real thing trying to step forward. The first moment I noticed something wrong was during breakfast. Sunlight poured through the kitchen window, casting my silhouette across the white tile floor. I reached for my coffee mug, and my shadow reached too, but not quite in sync. A fraction of a second behind, like watching a badly dubbed movie where the lips don't match the words. I paused, studying the dark shape at my feet. When I lifted my hand again, it followed perfectly. I told myself it was the angle of the sun. Light plays tricks. Shadows bend around objects, distort through glass. But the feeling lingered, a tiny knot of unease that settled in my chest and refused to dissolve. The next incident happened while I was working. My desk lamp created a sharp, defined shadow on the wall beside my computer screen. I was typing, lost in concentration, when peripheral vision caught something odd. My shadow's head had turned slightly to the left, as if looking at something beyond the edge of my vision. But I hadn't moved. My eyes remained fixed on the screen, my posture unchanged. I stopped typing and stared at the wall. The shadow snapped back into alignment, perfectly matching my position. The silence felt heavy, oppressive. I could hear my own breathing, the faint hum of the computer fan, the distant sound of traffic outside. Nothing else. I started paying attention after that. Really paying attention. During lunch, I positioned myself near the large window in the living room and watched my shadow as I ate. Most of the time, it behaved normally, but occasionally, I'd catch it making subtle movements I hadn't made. A slight tilt of the head, a finger that seemed to tap when mine were still. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Fatigue, stress, the mind playing tricks during long work sessions. But the observations were becoming more frequent, more pronounced. And they were always the same. My shadow appeared to be acting independently, as if it had developed its own agenda. I decided to document everything. I started a journal, recording each incident with clinical precision. The position of light sources, the surface the shadow fell upon, the specific movements that seemed out of sync. I even sketched rough diagrams, trying to capture the discrepancies I was witnessing. Page after page filled with observations. The shadow lingered when I stood up from my chair. It seemed to lean forward when I leaned back. Once, while brushing my teeth, I watched in the bathroom mirror as my shadow appeared to be brushing more vigorously than I was. The movements exaggerated and almost frantic. The smell started around the same period. A faint metallic scent, like old coins or copper pipes. It would appear suddenly, usually when I was most focused on my shadow's behavior. I'd turn to locate the source, but it would vanish as quickly as it had arrived. The scent had no logical origin. My home had no copper fixtures, no old metal objects that might corrode and create such an odor. I began setting up controlled experiments. I would stand in specific positions at certain parts of the day when the light was consistent and predictable. I'd perform simple movements, raising my arm, turning my head, taking a step forward, and carefully observe how my shadow responded. The results were disturbing. My shadow was developing a delay, not just a fraction of a second anymore, but a noticeable lag. I'd raise my right hand, and my shadow would raise its left. I'd step forward, and it would step backward. The disconnection was becoming more pronounced, more deliberate. One afternoon, while standing in my bedroom, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The shadow on the wall was moving when I wasn't. Small, subtle movements, but movements nonetheless. A finger twitching, the head turning slightly, like it was stretching, preparing for something. I stood perfectly still, barely breathing, watching this dark silhouette act independently of my body. The metallic smell grew stronger, filling the room with its strange, unsettling presence. The shadow seemed to sense my attention because it stopped moving and turned toward me. Not toward my position, but toward me specifically, as if making eye contact. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the shadow's behavior, trying to rationalize what I had witnessed. But rationalization was becoming impossible. The evidence was accumulating, each incident more disturbing than the last. I decided to confront the phenomenon directly. I set up a single lamp in my living room, creating a stark, controlled lighting environment. I positioned myself so that my shadow would fall clearly on the bare wall, with no obstructions or complications. Then I began to test its responses. I would make a movement and wait to see how the shadow would react. Sometimes it would mirror me perfectly. Other times it would lag behind. And increasingly, it would do something entirely different. The breakthrough came when I realized the shadow wasn't just acting independently. It was acting in opposition. When I moved right, it moved left. When I stepped forward, it stepped back, like it was trying to maintain some kind of balance, or perhaps trying to prevent me from moving in certain directions. I started speaking to it, asking questions, demanding explanations. The shadow would respond by becoming more animated, more deliberately contrary to my movements. the metallic smell would intensify, and I'd feel a strange, tingling sensation on my skin, like static electricity building up before a storm. One evening, as I sat in my chair under the single lamp, I noticed something that changed everything. I was sitting perfectly still, but my shadow was moving. Not small twitches anymore, but deliberate, purposeful movements. It was gesturing, pointing, trying to communicate something. I leaned forward to get a better look, and my shadow leaned back. I raised my hand, and it lowered its hand. We were perfectly synchronized in our opposition, like two people performing a carefully choreographed dance of contradiction. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My shadow wasn't malfunctioning or acting independently. It was trying to correct something. It was trying to maintain a balance that I was disrupting simply by existing. I stood up abruptly, and my shadow remained seated. I walked to the left, and it walked to the right. No matter what I did, it would do the opposite, as if we were two ends of a scale that needed to remain balanced. The metallic smell became overwhelming. The air itself felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't understand. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, my heart racing as I tried to process what was happening. Then I noticed something else. The shadow's movements were becoming more natural, more fluid, while my own movements felt increasingly stiff and unnatural, like I was the one having trouble moving properly, while it was becoming more comfortable in its own skin. I sat back down in my chair, breathing heavily, staring at the wall where my shadow should have been sitting too. But it remained standing, looking down at me with what I could only interpret as satisfaction. The room felt different now. The air smelled metallic and electric. The light from the lamp seemed dimmer, though I hadn't touched the switch, and my shadow, my own shadow, was standing there independently, no longer bound by my movements or intentions. I reached out toward the wall, toward the shadow, and felt something I'll never forget. The wall was warm. Not just warm, but pulsing gently, like a slow heartbeat. The shadow leaned forward, reaching toward my outstretched hand. When our hands should have met, I felt nothing. But I saw something that made my mind reel. On the wall, where my shadow's hand touched mine, there was a handprint. Not a shadow of a handprint, but an actual handprint, as if someone had pressed their palm against the wall from the other side. I jerked my hand back, handprint remained. A perfect outline of a human hand, slightly larger than my own, pressed into the wall like it was made of clay instead of plaster. Now I understand. The shadow isn't malfunctioning. It's not acting independently. It's trying to push through. And every day, it's getting stronger, more solid, more real. The handprint is still there, a permanent mark on my wall. I've stopped trying to rationalize it. I've stopped keeping detailed records. Instead, I sit in my chair under the single lamp, and I watch. I watch as my shadow moves with increasing confidence, increasing independence. I watch as it studies me, evaluates me, prepares for something I can't quite comprehend. The metallic smell has become constant now. The air in my home feels different, charged with potential. And sometimes, when I move, I feel resistance, as if something is trying to hold me back, trying to keep me in place. I think it's almost ready. My shadow has been practicing, learning, growing stronger. Soon, I believe, it won't need me anymore. It will step forward, and I will step back. And I wonder if anyone will notice the difference, or if they'll just see me, never knowing that the real me is still sitting in that chair, watching from the other side of the wall, trying to push through. Did you like this story? This one gave me chills in a different way. Not fear exactly, but that weird feeling something is watching us from inside. What would you have done if it were you? Let me know in the comments. Now let us move on to the next story. Story 3. It began with a ripple, a small one near the baseboard. I thought it was moisture or bad glue, but it pulsed again. So I leaned in. The wallpaper shifted ever so slightly, as if something was breathing underneath, pressing softly against the paper like skin under a bandage. I've started hearing tiny scrapes at night, like nails dragging along the inside of the wall. The pattern's changing now. The flowers are bending toward me, watching me, begging me not to peel them off. The living room had always been my sanctuary. Deep burgundy wallpaper with delicate cream roses, inherited from the previous owner. I'd grown fond of its vintage charm, the way afternoon light caught the subtle texture of each bloom. But that morning, something felt wrong. The air carried a faint metallic scent, like old coins left in a drawer too long. I dismissed it as the radiator acting up again. That first ripple appeared while I was reading. Just a tiny movement in my peripheral vision, so subtle I almost convinced myself it was fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. But when I set my book down and really looked, the paper near the corner seemed to breathe. Not dramatically, just a gentle rise and fall, as if the wall itself had developed lungs. I pressed my palm against the spot. The wallpaper felt warm, warmer than the rest of the wall. Through the paper, I could sense the faintest vibration, like a heartbeat muffled by layers of fabric. I pulled my hand away quickly, leaving a damp print on the surface. The roses in that section looked darker now, their petals curled inward as if protecting something precious. Sleep became elusive. Each night, I'd lie in bed listening to the scraping sounds that seemed to emerge from within the walls themselves. Delicate, persistent scratching, like fingernails testing the strength of their prison. I began leaving my phone on the nightstand, recording app ready, but the sounds never seemed to register on the device. Only my ears could catch them. I started a journal, documenting each occurrence. The movements were becoming more frequent, more bold. Entire sections of wallpaper would shift now, creating waves that rolled from floor to ceiling. The roses seemed to turn their faces toward me when I entered the room, their cream petals gaining an almost flesh-like quality in certain light. The metallic scent grew stronger. Sometimes it mixed with something else, something organic and sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I checked for leaks, examined the pipes, even called a contractor to inspect the walls. He found nothing unusual, just old plaster and wood beneath the paper. But he left quickly, claiming he had another appointment. I noticed his hands trembling as he packed his tools. I began spending more time in other rooms, but the wallpaper called to me. I'd find myself standing in the doorway, studying the patterns, trying to understand what was happening. The roses weren't just facing me now, they were following me. When I moved to the left, their petals would shift subtly in that direction. When I approached the wall, they seemed to lean forward, eager for contact. One evening, I decided to peel back a small section, just to see, just to understand. The paper resisted at first, clinging to the wall with unusual tenacity. But then it came away in my fingers, revealing not plaster underneath, but something soft and pale. Something that flinched when exposed to air. I dropped the torn paper and stepped back. The exposed area pulsed more visibly now, and from its edges, a thin, clear fluid began to seep. The metallic scent intensified, mixed with something raw and alive. I watched in horrified fascination as the wallpaper around the tier began to curl inward, trying to cover the wound I'd created. The scraping sounds that night were frantic, desperate. They came from every wall now, not just the living room. I huddled in my bed, covers pulled tight, listening to what sounded like dozens of fingernails clawing at the inside of every surface. The roses on the remaining wallpaper glowed faintly in the darkness, their cream petals luminescent with an inner light that had nothing to do with any electrical source. I couldn't bring myself to return to the living room the next day, but I could hear it from the kitchen, a wet, sliding sound, like something large moving behind the walls. The house felt different now, as if the act of peeling back that single section had awakened something that should have remained dormant. By evening, I couldn't resist anymore. I had to see what had become of the torn section. The wound had grown. What started as a small tear now stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing a surface that breathed and pulsed with visible veins running beneath translucent skin. The remaining wallpaper clung to the edges, its roses now clearly faces, distorted, pleading faces with petal lips that moved soundlessly. The metallic scent had evolved into something else entirely. Iron mixed with salt, with the sweet decay of flowers, with something indefinably human. I realized I was breathing in the exhalations of whatever lived between the walls and the world. I tried to leave then, packed a bag, grabbed my keys, headed for the door. But the hallway wallpaper bulged outward as I passed, creating barriers of soft, warm flesh that yielded when I pushed, but never quite let me through. The roses whispered now, their voices like static through old speakers, begging me to stay, to understand, to become part of the pattern. The house breathes around me now. The walls pulse with a rhythm that matches my heartbeat, and I've stopped trying to leave. The metallic taste is always on my tongue, and when I look in the mirror, I see cream roses blooming beneath my skin, their petals pressing against the surface, trying to break through. I've started a new journal, but the words keep changing after I write them. The ink shifts and flows, rearranging itself into patterns that look suspiciously like wallpaper designs. Sometimes I catch myself pressing my face against the wall, feeling the warmth underneath, listening to the whispered promises of something that was never meant to be contained by mere paper and paste. The roses are beautiful now that I understand them. They've been trying to show me something all along. Something about the space between surfaces, about the thin membrane that separates what is from what wants to be. I can feel them under my fingernails now, growing through the cracks in my perception, blooming in the spaces where thoughts should be. I don't think I'll be needing that journal much longer. Did you like this story? This one felt more eerie than terrifying, like the house wanted to be felt, loved, breathed in. What would you have done if the wall pulsed beneath your palm? Share your answer in the comments. Now get ready for the next story. Story 4. It's not the reflection that bothers me. It's the edge, the thin silver seam that separates this world from that one. I ran my fingertip along it once. It felt wet, not like water, something thicker, slow, deliberate. Since then, I've seen things at the very corners of the glass. Eyes that don't move, mouths that don't open, just resting behind the surface like they're waiting for the edge to erode. I think it's softening. I think I'm the only one who notices. The bathroom mirror came with the apartment. Ancient thing, probably installed decades ago. The silver backing had begun to peel in places, creating dark spots that looked like stains on the reverse side of reality. I'd grown accustomed to brushing my teeth around these imperfections, angling my face to avoid the worst of them. But the edge, that was new. I first noticed it after a particularly long shower. The steam had fogged everything, and as I wiped the glass clean with my palm, my thumb caught on something unexpected. A ridge, subtle, but definitely there. When I looked closer, the mirror's edge appeared to have swollen slightly, as if the glass had absorbed moisture and expanded like wood. That night, I took a flashlight and examined every inch of the frame. The metal housing seemed normal, but where it met the glass, there was definitely a change. The surface felt organic somehow, yielding slightly under pressure. I pressed harder, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I felt something press back from the other side. I started keeping a journal. Not because I believed anything supernatural was happening. I needed to document what I assumed was some kind of environmental damage. Humidity, temperature fluctuations, maybe a slow leak in the pipes behind the wall. Rational explanations for irrational sensations. The entries began simply enough. Mirror edge still swollen, soft to touch. But as the days passed, the observations became more detailed, more concerned. The wetness wasn't just moisture. It had a viscosity, almost like saliva. The surface would dimple under my finger, leaving temporary indentations that slowly filled back in. I began photographing the mirror from different angles, trying to capture the subtle changes. In the photos, everything looked normal, but through the viewfinder, just before I pressed the shutter, I could see the slight distortion. The edge wasn't just soft, it was moving, breathing. The smell started around the same time. Faint at first, like pennies mixed with something floral. Roses, maybe, but roses that had been left too long in stagnant water. The scent would hit me strongest when I leaned close to the mirror, as if it were seeping through the softening edge. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my imagination amplifying normal household odors. But the smell grew stronger, more distinct. Sometimes I'd catch it in other rooms, and I'd follow the scent trail back to the bathroom, where it always seemed to originate from that increasingly pliable border between glass and frame. The sounds came next. Soft scraping, like fingernails on the inside of the glass. Always from the edges, never from the center. I'd press my ear against the mirror, listening, and the scratching would stop. But the moment I pulled away, it would resume, more insistent. I started recording these sounds with my phone. Hours of audio files, most containing nothing but room tone and my own breathing. But occasionally, buried in the static, there were whispers. Not words exactly, more like the shape of words, the intention of language without the structure. The worst part was the waiting, because that's what it felt like, waiting. The presence behind the mirror wasn't aggressive or hostile. It was patient, persistent, like it knew that eventually the barrier would weaken enough for something to happen. I considered replacing the mirror, but something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the growing certainty that this wasn't just about one piece of glass in one bathroom. This was something bigger, and removing the mirror would only force it to find another way through. The edge continued to soften. I could now press my finger nearly a quarter-inch into the surface before meeting resistance. The wetness had become more pronounced, leaving a thin film on my skin that took longer to dry than normal water. The scent of copper and dying flowers had become a constant presence, following me throughout the apartment. I started seeing the shapes more clearly. Not reflections. That would have been explicable. These were forms that existed in the space between the glass and the silver backing, trapped in that narrow dimension where light bent and reality grew thin. They moved with the sluggish quality of things underwater, pressing against the barrier from the inside. One evening, as I was washing my hands, I noticed something new. The water from the faucet was running normally, but in the mirror's reflection, it appeared to be flowing upward. Not dramatically, just a slight defiance of gravity that made my stomach lurch. I turned off the tap and watched the reflected water continue to rise for several seconds before finally stopping. That's when I knew I had to act. I couldn't simply document this anymore. I couldn't pretend it was just environmental damage or perceptual tricks. Something was actively wrong with the mirror, and it was getting worse. I returned to the bathroom with a small hammer, intending to break the glass and end whatever was happening. But as I raised the tool, the mirror's surface began to ripple. Not like water, more like thick gel, disturbed by movement beneath. The shapes I'd been seeing at the edges were now clearly visible, pressing upward against the increasingly thin barrier. The surface bulged outward, and for a moment I could make out the distinct impression of a hand, fingers spread wide, pushing from the inside. Then another hand, and another. The mirror wasn't just soft anymore, it was permeable. I brought the hammer down, but instead of shattering, the glass absorbed the impact like thick rubber. The blow sent ripples across the entire surface, and the shapes beneath became more agitated, more distinct. I could see faces now, pressing against the barrier, their features distorted by the medium they were trapped in. I hit it again, harder this time. The mirror stretched like taffy, the center bulging outward, while the edges remained fixed to the frame. The wetness was everywhere now, coating my hands, dripping onto the bathroom floor. The smell of copper and rotting flowers had become overwhelming. The third blow finally broke through, not with the sharp crack of shattering glass, but with a wet, tearing sound. The mirror split open like an overripe fruit, and something that wasn't quite air rushed out. Something thick and humid and alive. I stumbled backward as shapes began to emerge from the tear. Not fully formed, not entirely there, more like the suggestion of figures, wavering at the edge of existence. They moved with that same underwater quality I'd observed before, reaching toward me with limbs that seemed to be made of shadow and silver. I ran, left the bathroom, left the apartment, spent the night in my car in the parking lot. When I finally worked up the courage to return the next morning, the mirror was intact, perfectly normal. The frame was secure, the glass was clear, and the edge felt solid and dry. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And now, everywhere I go, I notice the mirrors. I notice how they're all slightly different at the edges, how the seam between glass and frame isn't quite as solid as it should be. I notice the way my reflection sometimes takes a fraction of a second longer to move when I move. The wetness is still there on my fingers. I can't wash it off. It's been weeks now, and it's spreading up my hands, along my arms. Sometimes I catch myself pressing against other mirrors, feeling for that familiar softness, that yielding boundary between here and there. I think the edge was never really made of glass at all. I think it was made of something much thinner, much more fragile. And now that it's been broken once, it's easier to break again. The barrier is weakening everywhere, and I'm not sure which side of the mirror I'm really on anymore. The apartment is empty now. New tenants moved in last week. I've been watching from across the street, waiting to see if they notice what I noticed. Waiting to see if they'll run their fingers along the edge of that bathroom mirror. Waiting to see if they'll feel the wetness, smell the copper and dying roses. I think they will. I think the edge was never meant to hold forever. And now that it's started to fail, it's going to keep failing, spreading from mirror to mirror, until the boundary between this world and that one becomes so thin that it doesn't matter anymore. The wetness is almost to my shoulders now. Soon, I think, I'll understand what's on the other side of the glass. Soon, I'll be able to press back against someone else's exploring fingers, to wait patiently behind someone else's mirror, until their edge grows soft enough for me to finally push through. Did you enjoy that story? Personally, it got under my skin more than usual. The idea that a mirror isn't just reflective, but a living, breathing membrane that softens, responds, and presses back that chilling. Think about it. How many times have you leaned into a mirror at night without realizing how thin that barrier really is? What would you do if you felt something wet and alive at the edge of your mirror? Tell us in the comments. Let us move on to the next story. Story 5. The light above me flickers not randomly, but rhythmically. At first, I blamed the wiring, but I noticed it matched something deep. It pulses with my breath when I'm anxious, but against it when I'm calm, like it wants to train me. I've started staring at the ceiling every night, and lately it started responding faster, syncing to my heartbeat. I can't tell if it's alive or if it's trying to wake me up to something I shouldn't see. The rhythm began subtly. I would lie in bed, sheets twisted around my legs, and watch the soft glow dim and bright in perfect intervals. 1 second on, 2 seconds off, like a mechanical heartbeat that somehow knew mine. The plaster above felt warm against my fingertips when I stood on a chair to investigate. Not hot, just warm enough to feel deliberate. The electrical box showed no problems. The bulb screwed in tight, yet the pulsing continued. I started keeping notes. The pattern shifted based on my emotional state. When I felt nervous about work presentations, the light would flash rapidly, almost frantic. During peaceful moments reading, it would slow to a gentle throb. I tested this theory deliberately, thinking of stressful memories while watching the ceiling. The response was immediate. The light would quicken, as if feeding off my anxiety, growing brighter with each pulse. Sleep became impossible. I would close my eyes and still see the rhythm behind my eyelids, burned into my retinas. The warmth from the ceiling seemed to spread downward, creating a strange, tingling sensation across my forehead. I bought blackout curtains and unplugged every electronic device, but the pulsing continued. Even with the main light switch off, a faint glow emanated from somewhere within the ceiling itself. I decided to record everything. My phone captured the visual changes, the way shadows danced across the walls in perfect synchronization. But when I played back the footage, the recordings showed nothing. Just steady, normal lighting. The audio picked up something else, though. A low humming sound that I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't mechanical. It sounded organic, like breathing through water. The smell came next. Sweet at first, like vanilla mixed with something medicinal. It would drift down from the ceiling in waves, strongest when the pulsing intensified. I checked for gas leaks, mold, anything that might explain the scent. The house inspector found nothing, but I knew it was there. Others couldn't smell it when they visited. They looked at me with concern when I mentioned it, as if I were describing something impossible. I started mapping the rhythm, drawing charts, timing each pulse with a stopwatch. The patterns were complex but consistent. The light would pulse 7 times, pause, then pulse 3 times. Sometimes it would reverse the sequence. I realized it was responding not just to my current state, but anticipating my reactions. When I thought about getting up for water, the pulsing would shift before I moved. When I considered calling someone, it would dim completely, as if disapproving. The ceiling began to feel lower. Not visibly, but I could sense it pressing down. The warm spots spread outward from the center, creating a map of heat that I could trace with my hands. The plaster felt softer in these areas, yielding slightly under pressure. I pressed harder one night, and my fingers sank into the surface. Just a fraction, but enough to leave a small indentation that remained visible the next morning. I tried sleeping in other rooms, but the pulsing followed. Every ceiling in the house developed the same rhythm. The bathroom light, the kitchen fixture, even the lamp in the basement. They all synchronized, creating a network of pulsing illumination that seemed to track my movement through the house. I would walk from room to room, and the lights would activate in sequence, like a path being illuminated for me to follow. The humming sound grew louder. I could hear it through the walls now, a constant vibration that seemed to come from within the structure itself. My neighbors noticed nothing. They thought I was stressed, suggested I take a vacation. But I knew I couldn't leave. The house needed me here. The pulsing would stop if I left, and somehow that felt wrong, like abandoning something that depended on me. I started talking to the ceiling, asking questions, waiting for responses in the pattern of flashes. 2 pulses for yes, 1 for no. The system worked perfectly. The ceiling knew things about me that I hadn't told anyone. It knew about the argument with my mother, the mistake I made at work, the secret I'd kept for years. It communicated through light, through warmth, through that sweet medicinal smell that now filled every room. The night everything changed, I was lying in bed watching the familiar rhythm when the pulsing stopped completely. The silence felt deafening. I sat up, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting. Then, slowly, the entire surface began to glow. Not from the light fixture, but from the plaster itself. A soft, phosphorescent gleam that revealed details I'd never seen before. There were veins running through the ceiling, like a circulatory system. They pulsed with a fluid that looked dark against the pale glow. I climbed onto the bed, reaching up to touch the illuminated surface. The plaster felt warm and slightly damp. As my fingers made contact, the glow intensified, and I felt a pulse travel up my arm. Not painful, but foreign. Like something was was testing my nervous system, learning how I worked. The veins in the ceiling began to match the pattern of veins in my own hand, creating a mirror image that connected us. The smell became overwhelming, sweet and medicinal, but now with an underlying scent of copper. I tried to pull my hand away, but the surface held me gently, not forcefully, but with a persistent suction that made separation difficult. The pulsing had moved into my body now. I could feel it in my chest, in my temples, behind my eyes. We were synchronized completely. I understood then that the ceiling wasn't just responding to me. It was learning from me. Every night, every pulse, every moment of connection had been a lesson. It was studying human patterns, human responses, human consciousness. And now it was ready to try something new. The glow spread across my vision, and I felt myself sinking slightly into the warm surface. Not physically, but mentally. Like being pulled into a dream while remaining awake. The ceiling was offering me something, a trade. My patterns for its knowledge, my consciousness for its perspective. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. Instead, I felt the sweet air flowing into my lungs, carrying that familiar scent deeper into my system. The pulsing had become my heartbeat. The warmth had become my blood temperature. The glow had become my vision. When I woke the next morning, I was lying in my bed, staring at a perfectly normal ceiling. The light fixture hung motionless. No pulsing, no warmth, no glow, but something had changed. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed the same face, but my eyes held a different light. Behind my pupils, if I looked carefully, I could see the faintest trace of that phosphorescent glow. I still feel the rhythm, not from the ceiling anymore, but from within. Every heartbeat carries that familiar pulse. Every breath follows the pattern I learned during those sleepless nights. The ceiling taught me something, and now I understand why it needed to learn. I'm not the same person who first noticed the flickering light. I'm something more, something connected to the network of pulsing illumination that exists just beyond normal perception. And sometimes, late at night, I catch other people staring at their own ceilings, waiting for the rhythm to begin. The sweet medicinal smell follows me everywhere now. Others can't detect it, but I know it's there. It's the scent of connection, of understanding, of becoming part of something larger than individual consciousness. The ceiling didn't just pulse for me, it was preparing me. I've started leaving my lights on at night, not for comfort, but as a signal, a beacon for others who might be ready to learn what I learned. The pulsing will begin again, in other rooms, in other houses, for other people who are ready to pay attention. The rhythm is spreading, and I'm helping it grow. Did you enjoy that story? It really got to me in a quiet but unnerving way. The idea that something as ordinary as a ceiling light could sink to your emotions and gradually merge with your body. That's terrifying because it feels so plausible. It's as if some quiet intelligence lives in the walls, in the current, in the rhythm we never noticed until it's too late. What would you do if your heartbeat started syncing with your bedroom light? Let us know in the comments. Let us move on to the next story. Story 6. There shouldn't be space. It's an interior wall, solid, sealed. But when I nudged the shelf forward, it groaned like something old had been trapped behind it. There were stairs carved into rough stone, descending in a spiral I couldn't measure. I haven't gone all the way down, not yet. But every night, I hear the creak of one more step taken upward. Never hurried, never loud, always one step closer. The shelf doesn't push back anymore. The discovery happened during a routine cleaning session. I was reorganizing my books when I noticed the shelf wasn't flush against the wall anymore. A gap had formed, barely wide enough for my fingers to slip through. The air that escaped felt different, cooler, carrying the scent of wet stone, and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic, like old wood or dried leaves. I assumed the wall had settled, maybe shifted with the foundation. These things happen in older buildings, but when I pressed my palm against the shelf to push it back, it wouldn't budge. The wood felt warm under my touch, almost alive, and I could swear I felt a faint vibration traveling up from below. That's when I decided to pull the shelf away from the wall entirely. The opening revealed itself slowly, like a secret unwrapping. First, just darkness. Then, as my eyes adjusted, the outline of stone steps became visible. They were carved with precision, each one perfectly level, disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow light. The walls on either side were smooth, worn by countless touches over time I couldn't fathom. I fetched a flashlight and aimed it into the passage. The beam stretched down the spiral staircase, revealing perhaps 10 steps before the curve hid the rest. The stone was a pale gray, almost white, with darker veins running through it like frozen rivers. My light reflected off moisture that clung to the walls, creating patterns that shifted as I moved the beam. The smell grew stronger as I stood at the threshold. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was wrong for this space. It belonged in a forest, not behind my wall. I breathed it in deeper, trying to place it, when I heard the first sound, a whisper of movement from below. Not footsteps, but something softer, like fabric brushing against stone, or paper being shuffled in the distance. I held my breath and listened, but the sound had stopped. I should have pushed the shelf back and forgotten about it. Instead, I placed one foot on the first step. The stone felt solid beneath my weight, but it was warm. Too warm for stone that had been sealed behind a wall. I descended 2 more steps, then 3, keeping one hand on the wall for balance. The surface under my palm was smooth as glass, worn by passage of time and touch. The spiral curved gently, and with each step down, the temperature seemed to rise. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, catching details I hadn't noticed before. There were marks in the stone, not carved, but pressed, as if something had been embedded and then removed. The patterns were geometric, almost like symbols, but they made no sense to me. I counted 15 steps before I stopped. The passage continued downward, deeper than should have been possible given the layout of the building. I was already below the ground floor, yet the stairs kept descending. The air moved differently here, circulating in ways that suggested a much larger space beyond my sight. I called out, testing the acoustics. My voice echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed and then released back to me changed. The echo seemed to come from multiple directions at once, creating a harmony with itself that made my skin crawl. That's when I turned back. The climb up felt longer than the descent. Each step required more effort than it should have, as if the stone was pulling gently at my feet. When I finally reached the top, I was breathing hard, though the exertion hadn't been that significant. I pushed the shelf back against the wall, wedging it firmly in place. The gap disappeared, leaving only the familiar sight of my books arranged in neat rows. But the smell lingered in the room for hours afterward. That forest scent that had no business being there. Sleep came fitfully that night. kept thinking about the warmth of the stone, the way the walls seemed to pulse with life. I had expected to find a construction error, maybe a forgotten storage space. Instead, I had discovered something that felt ancient and purposeful. The next morning, I examined the shelf more carefully. The wood showed no signs of movement, no scratches or wear marks that would indicate it had been displaced. The wall behind it appeared solid, unmarked. I pressed my ear against it, listening for any sound from within, but heard only the typical silence of interior walls. I might have convinced myself it was all a strange dream if not for the dirt under my fingernails. Stone dust, the kind that comes from touching old masonry, and the smell, fainter now, but still present, that reminded me of places I'd never been. The sounds started on the second night. I was lying in bed, nearly asleep, when I heard it. A soft scraping like leather sole against stone. Just one step, deliberate and careful. I sat up, listening intently, but silence had returned. I checked the shelf, still firmly in place, no gaps visible. The next night, I heard it again. One step, a pause, then nothing. Always from behind the wall, always at the same time as I was drifting off to sleep. I began to time it, though I tried to avoid thinking about specific hours. It came when my consciousness was most vulnerable, when the barrier between sleep and waking was thinnest. I started leaving my flashlight next to the bed, ready to investigate. But every time I checked, the shelf remained unmoved. The wall showed no signs of disturbance. Yet the sound persisted, night after night, growing more distinct. After a week, I could distinguish details. The step wasn't just one footfall. It was a careful placement, a testing of weight, followed by a settling. Someone was climbing those stairs, one step at a time, with infinite patience. I began documenting everything. The time the sound occurred, its duration, any variations in tone or intensity. I sketched the layout of the stairs from memory, noting the curve and the depth I had reached. I researched the building's history, looking for any mention of hidden passages or unusual construction. The records showed nothing. The building was straightforward, built to standard specifications. No mention of stonework, no previous owners reporting anomalies. Yet the evidence was accumulating in my notebook. Page after page of observations that painted a picture of something impossible. The breakthrough came when I decided to record the sound. I set up a digital recorder near the wall and waited. When the familiar scraping came, I captured it clearly. But when I played it back, I heard something else underneath the footstep. A faint whisper, like air moving through a small opening. I played the recording again, enhancing the volume. The whisper became clearer, resolving into something that might have been words. Not in any language I recognized, but with the rhythm and cadence of speech. Someone was talking as they climbed, carrying on a conversation I couldn't understand. That night, I moved the shelf again. The passage was exactly as I had left it, but something had changed. The air felt different, more active, as if it had been recently disturbed. The stone dust on the steps showed signs of disturbance, though I couldn't be certain I hadn't caused it myself during my previous descent. I descended further this time, counting carefully. 20 steps, 30, 40. The spiral continued, deeper than any building had a right to go. The walls remained smooth, but the mysterious markings grew more frequent. Some were raised, others depressed, creating a texture that my fingers could read even in darkness. At the 50th step, I found something new. A small alcove had been carved into the wall, just large enough for a person to stand in. The stone here was different, darker, with a surface that felt almost soft to the touch. Inside the alcove, someone had left items. A piece of cloth, folded neatly. A small object that might have been a button or a coin. And something else, something that made my blood freeze. A notebook, similar to the one I had been using to document my experiences. The pages were filled with handwriting I didn't recognize, but the content was familiar. Observations about sounds in the night. Sketches of the staircase. Questions about the building's history. Even the layout was similar to my own notes, as if the writer had been following the same process of investigation. The entries were dated, but the system made no sense to me. The numbers didn't correspond to any calendar I knew, but the progression was clear. Weeks of documentation, growing more detailed and urgent as it continued. The final entry was different from the others. The handwriting was shaky, less controlled. It described a realization that the sounds weren't coming from below anymore. They were coming from above. Someone else had had found the passage. Someone else was investigating. I dropped the notebook and ran. The climb up was a nightmare of stumbling and panic. The steps seemed to multiply under my feet, each one requiring enormous effort to surmount. The walls pressed closer, or perhaps I was simply more aware of the confined space. My flashlight beam wobbled wildly, casting dancing shadows that looked like reaching hands. When I finally reached the top, I threw myself through the opening and shoved the shelf back into place with desperate strength. The wood slammed against the wall with a sound like a gunshot, and I stood there gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. The notebook was still in my hand. I sat at my desk and read through it completely, looking for any clue about who had written it. The handwriting was neat, methodical, but told me nothing about the person behind it. The observations were detailed, scientific, approaching the mystery with the same rational mindset I had employed. But as I read, I began to notice something that made my skin crawl. The progression of events described in the notebook matched my own experience exactly. The discovery of the gap, the initial investigation, the nightly sounds, the decision to record them. Even the timing was identical. The final entries described finding the alcove, discovering the notebook, and realizing the truth. But they were written in my handwriting. I compared the pages carefully, holding them up to the light. The paper was different, older, yellowed with age. But the words were mine, written in my distinctive style, describing experiences I had lived. The notebook fell from my hands as the implication hit me. Someone had been here before. Someone had gone through exactly what I was going through, and they had left their record behind for the next person to find. I looked at the shelf, solid and immovable against the wall. But I knew now that it wouldn't stay that way. The gap would appear again. The passage would call to me, and I would descend those stairs once more. Because that's what the person before me had done, and the person before them. The sound came again that night, but it was different now. Not one step, but two. One from below, climbing up. One from above, descending down. They met somewhere in the middle, in the darkness between the floors, and for a moment there was silence. Then the footsteps began again, but now they were synchronized. Two people walking the same path, separated by time, but following identical routes. The sound continued until dawn. A steady rhythm that seemed to echo in my bones. I haven't moved the shelf since then, but I know I will. The notebook waits in my desk drawer, and each night I add another entry, documenting the sounds that grow clearer and more insistent. I know now that someone else will find these pages, will read my words, and follow my path. The gap has appeared again. The shelf no longer fits flush against the wall. And tonight, as I write these final words, I can hear 3 sets of footsteps on the stone stairs. 2 climbing up, 1 descending down. The passage is calling, and I know I must answer. But I also know that I won't be the last to hear that call. Someone else will find the gap, will feel the pull of the spiral staircase, will descend into the warm darkness and discover the truth. The shelf doesn't push back anymore. It never did. It was never meant to. Did you enjoy that story? It left me deeply unsettled. The idea of a hidden passage behind an interior wall, something that simply shouldn't be there, is disturbing enough. But what truly got me was the slow seduction of it. Every detail, every sound, pulling you in, step by step, until you have to follow. And when the notebook appears, written in your own handwriting at S, as if time itself has folded in on you, locking you into a loop. What would you do if you heard footsteps rising from a passage that doesn't exist? Let us know in the comments. Let us move on to the next story. Story 7. It's a small fixture, hardly noticeable, tucked behind a chair no one sits in. One day, I flipped the switch and the bulb stayed on. I replaced it, still on. I cut the power, still on. It casts a soft, yellow glow, but anything placed in that light appears slightly different. Faces seem longer. Smiles stretch a little too far. I left a mirror in the beam once. It showed the chair was occupied. I haven't moved it since. The apartment smells of dust. And something else, something sweet and metallic, like pennies left in warm milk. I notice it most when I walk past that corner, where the light refuses to acknowledge my authority over it. The scent clings to my clothes afterward, following me from room to room like a patient animal. I've started keeping a journal, not because I believe in documenting the impossible, but because my memory feels unreliable lately. Words I'm certain I've written appear different when I read them back. The handwriting looks like mine, but the letters seem to lean in directions I don't remember choosing. Yesterday, I recorded the sound coming from the fixture. At first, there was nothing, just the ambient hum of a building settling into itself. But when I played it back through headphones, I heard something else. A whisper, distorted and fragmented, like someone speaking underwater. The voice was saying numbers. Always the same sequence, over and over. I've been leaving objects in the light's path, testing its peculiar influence. A photograph of my family becomes something else entirely. Faces I recognize, but can't place. Expressions that shift when I'm not looking directly at them. The eyes follow me now, tracking my movements with a patience that makes my skin crawl. The mirror incident happened 3 weeks ago. I positioned it carefully, angling it to catch the light's reflection. When I looked into it, the empty chair showed an occupant, a figure hunched forward, hands folded in its lap. The face was obscured, but I could see its chest rising and falling with steady breath. I backed away, but the reflection remained constant. The figure never moved, never acknowledged my presence, just sat there breathing in a chair that held nothing but air. I've stopped trying to fix the light. The maintenance people won't come anymore. They claim they've been here multiple times, but I have no memory of their visits. The building manager insists the electrical system is functioning perfectly. When I show him the corner, he stares at it with confusion, asking why I'm concerned about a lamp that isn't there. But I see it. I see the yellow glow painting everything in its vicinity with subtle wrongness. I see how shadows bend toward it instead of away, how the dust motes dance in patterns that defy the room's air currents. I see the way my reflection in the television screen warps when I stand too close, stretching my features into something that belongs to someone else. The whispers have grown clearer. They're not random numbers anymore. They're measurements, dimensions, coordinates to somewhere I can't identify, but feel pulled toward. I've started walking to the corner without meaning to, finding myself standing in the light's embrace before I realize I've moved. The temperature changes when I'm there. The air becomes thick, almost liquid, pressing against my skin with invisible weight. My clothes feel different, heavier, as if they're made of fabric I've never worn before. When I look down at my hands, they appear longer, the fingers more tapered, the skin pale in ways that don't match my memory of myself. I brought a friend over once. She couldn't see the light either, but she kept rubbing her arms and asking why the apartment felt so cold.